Hi, I'm Gordon Lamphere, and welcome to the Real Finds Podcast, the podcast where we have real conversations with key entrepreneurs, activists, and researchers who are shaping the real estate industry and, as a result, our world. On today's podcast, we'll be speaking with Rod Kritsberg. Rod is Chief Investment Officer at KPG Funds, a New York-focused investment and development company whose mission is to acquire and reinvest in value-add office, retail, and mixed-use properties. On today's podcast, Rod shares how he turned historic buildings in SoHo and the West Village into some of Manhattan's most desirable boutique offices. We unpack what office amenities are BS and why boutique landlords get kitchens wrong. Ultimately, we talk about some of the hard truths of what it takes to thrive in high barrier cities like New York. So if you're a broker, investor, or developer in the world of office space, today's podcast is well worth a listen. Rod, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Happy to do it. Happy to be here.
So can you give me a little bit about how you got into the whole real estate game?
How I got into the whole real estate game. I will tell you the story as far back as you want to hear it. But I actually started in real estate accidentally during the boom years of 2005, if you remember those years back then when everybody was buying residential housing. So I actually was in college back then, and my brother-in-law had a real estate agency, a residential real estate agency. He's like, "Hey, do you want a job?" And I was like, "Why not? Yeah, looks like everybody's making money in real estate. I'd love it." So I actually got in whatever that is, 20 years ago now, just renting apartments and just sort of learning the business that way. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but then got my broker's license as fast as possible, turned sort of residential business into a commercial brokerage business, started a brokerage, sold the brokerage, went on to run acquisitions for a high net worth family office, left that, started a company, fast forward, started fund one, raised fund one into fund two. And that's kind of where we are today. And that's the quickest way I can get through 20 years of real estate.
Well, that's pretty fast. One of the things that
Yeah.
we'd like to do is we'd like to fastly get into, I think, one of the things that makes you unique. And
Hmm.
we have a lot of folks on that are from REITs and large funds that really aren't doing anything unique in the market, but they're still adding value. And I think one of the things that makes
Hmm.
you unique, particular, in some of your funds is you're a boutique New York development shop in many ways, and so you
Hmm.
work with some pretty
Hmm.
unique properties, not just
Yeah.
run of the mill, very standard, could plop anywhere properties. So I'm curious,
Yeah.
how do you develop that as your niche?
You know, kind of fell into it. Look, we want to say we're the smartest people that ever lived, and knew that, post COVID, boutique office would be, sort of the asset class du jour in office, if it were, or, sort of ultra high end class A office would be what people want. But ultimately, we started sort of with the concept because we loved we saw a space where there were really beautiful architecturally significant buildings in markets that had really high barrier to entry. And when I say markets, I mean specifically sort of Manhattan submarkets. I don't know how much of your listener base is in New York, but if you know markets like SoHo or the West Village, or there's real reasons for the barrier to entry. Part of them is the Department of Buildings and something called Landmarks Preservation Commission. So you basically aren't allowed to touch anything on the facade, or if you do, you have to restore it to what it was, sort of 150 years ago. Anyway, so it created a high barrier to entry to come in and renovate any of these assets. And historically, if one of these assets was vacant, it would go residential, and that was sort of the highest and best use. As, the office market grew and developed, there was this real need for sort of institutional quality, asset building in those markets, because there was, a desire of tenants to want to be there. So we saw the opportunity and started doing that back in, sort of 18, 19. And then through the COVID years, as it happened, all of a sudden that became what everybody wanted, right? So everybody talks about it to death, sort of the barbell effect. Everybody was looking for something really, really nice, ultra class A, something special, or something incredibly cheap, and sort of nothing in between. So we luckily fit into that category and a niche, right? So we were class A, but we didn't have to compete with sort of the one Vanderbilts of the world. And we didn't have to fight over Amazon or Meta being our tenant for, 500,000 or 300,000 square feet, right? So our whole business plan was you take these really gorgeous, architecturally significant buildings, you renovate them, sort of like we always say, we renovate them as if it was a ground up construction. We only keep the, four perimeter walls and, the vertical sort of columns and wood joists and everything else is brand new. And that helped attract, sort of the tenancy. Sort of that's it.
So, in terms of that, one of the
Mm-hmm.
buildings I think that's unique and a unique deal that you worked on, and look, not all of our listener base is from New York, but it's a significant portion. I'd say maybe at least 10 or 15% of folks at least are in the New York metro area. Um,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of that, one of the interesting spaces is the development that you've done at 132 West 14th Street. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious kind of how you saw that project and what got you involved and kind of how you pursued that kind of as a case study.
Sure. So, it's a funny kind of sad case study or at its sort of at its start, because that was a COVID deal, sort of real mid-pandemic situation where, there was a large national nonprofit, owned two assets, one smaller, one larger, had a business plan to exit the smaller asset, monetize it somehow, and they started that process, I want to say January, February of 2020, and then would not stop that train once it started rolling, even through the lockdowns and everything else. So March, April, May of that year, they were still committed to that process, right? So, uh, and I've told this story before. It was kind of a wild time to be in real estate generally, especially if you have to tour assets. My family and I actually moved down to Florida for a few months during that time, and I flew up to walk this building. There was nobody on the street. 14th Street's big, wide, busy street. We were standing in the middle of 14th Street. There wasn't a car in sight, basically in a hazmat suit, walking this vacant asset. And even though we couldn't understand why they were committed, sort of following through with their business plan, the brokers explained to us that, once they sort of commit to something, it's way too complicated to turn them around. But we took advantage of the opportunity that was in front of us. So when I walked it and I saw I could get this building at, 60, 70% below its 2019 value, it felt like a real opportunity, right? And it was an architecturally significant building of its time, right? It was built to, in the 1920s, 100 years ago. But since that time, as it was owned by this nonprofit, it was never taken care of. It had this, we looked at the historical photos. It had this beautiful masonry facade with these arched windows and all these things that was, you know, over its whatever it is 100-year lifespan since then, was covered in these awful concrete panels and glued on, basically to just not have to take care of the facade. They did whatever they had to do, and they used it as auxiliary office, and it was an absolute disaster on the inside. But from a value perspective, we said, hey, this is a great location, right? And this is a good building. It's great size, perfect floor plates. There's demand in this market. Everybody's going to want it. Let's take advantage of the opportunity and get it at this really discounted sort of value. And then from a development perspective, we didn't build it right away. We waited until sort of the market was willing to accept, new office in this location, and try to figure out, where the market was headed, get our head around what the future of New York City office was. And that wasn't, sort of very clear. It was a bit opaque, especially during that sort of first year of the pandemic. And there was the big call of, work from home, and nobody was ever coming back to the office. We ended up getting a construction loan on it once we saw that there was a return to office, but it was a return to a very specific type of office, right? And we talked about it in the beginning. It's either you had a great location with boutique floors, single tenant floors, with really ultra high end space, or you had sort of these ultra class A buildings, that people wanted to be in. And that was kind of it, right? And that was dominating the market. So when we saw that demand a few years later, we got a construction loan to then build the asset. We said, how can we build this asset to make it attractive? Originally, we thought maybe we could bring it back to its original sort of masonry facade. We quickly realized that wouldn't make any sense. So what we wanted to do was keep the footprint of the building, right? It had these really great footprints, about 8,000 square feet floors, which is great for these sort of smaller, mid-sized, high-end companies to go single tenant floors. And what we did was we kept the two perimeter walls, east and west. We tore off the north facade and the south facade and added two floors, reset the floor heights. For all intents and purposes, it's a ground up construction project that is sitting on the footprint of a sort of existing building. And by doing that, we kept some of the old code versus some of the new building code and the requirements for rear lots and things like that, where we didn't have to shrink the footprint of the building and then still maximize the volume of it. And that was very important. And again, this is just for the New Yorkers. That was very important to us because the front of this building, quote unquote, the north side, opens up to a big wide street, 14th Street. So obviously it's going to get a lot of natural light. But the south side of the building, interestingly enough, where you usually have the rear of the building is usually impacted. There's other buildings behind it, especially when you're a mid-block building. This building sits in a really interesting place, right at the northern end of what's called sort of Greenwich Village. And what happens is the street behind us is all low-rise townhouses, and it's all low-rise townhouses that are all landmarked for the next 15 to 20 blocks south. So us being a 6, 7, 8-story building, we have this incredible view out the rear facade of our building, which is arguably nicer than the front. So by doing all the things that we did, we managed to add height, maintain volume, get those good floor heights, keep the views, and then ultimately have these, make it feel like you're in a ground up Class A building without ever tearing down the full structure.
So,
It's an interesting concept.
fascinating concept. I'd like to dive into one element of that you kind of
Mhm.
touched on, and that's
Sure.
you mentioned kind of post 2020 amenities and design elements that tenants are looking for. And I was wondering if you could dive a little deeper into that because that's one of the biggest discussions that we've been having. And I'm curious, what does a high-end New York tenant look for in terms of design elements and amenities?
So I want to tackle the harder one first because I think I'm contrarian on this point. Amenities are all BS, and I'm going to tell you what I mean. No, no, no. I mean it.
No, no, yeah,
If you have no, no, no. If you have especially a smaller building, maybe if you're in a larger building, maybe you can amenitize then. But candidly, nobody's going to the gym in the office. Meaning, nobody's going to the gym in a large office building that's specific to the office building, right? A real amenity in an office building, in a larger one, is having like a Equinox or a Lifetime Fitness, a really high end gym there, so people can actually use that space the way they would use the gym normally. The only other thing that I've noticed is an amenity of any value at all, is if you have smaller office spaces, meaning sub 15,000 feet, a massive boardroom that can fit 40 to 50 people, right? Not just a 10-person conference room. I'm talking about a massive boardroom because that happens where you do have, especially high-end financials, as some of our tenants, where there'll be a smaller fund, but they'll have their quarterly meeting or something like that, or they'll have an investor meeting. So then they'll need a very large gathering space, right? Outside of that, nothing. The amenity, this is what we've learned. The amenity is the space, the amenity is the location. And I'll tell you what I mean. And I'll start with location first. How do you attract talent, right? That's what everybody cares about. How do you attract talent? How do you retain talent, right? And how do you get them to get their butts into the office? Those are simple. Make their office nicer than their home, right? Make it so that when they walk into that space, it feels like they're walking into a high-end residential condo. And I'll speak for that a little bit when I'll get to it. And then the second part is put it in a place where they're happy to come to every day, right? And that is just so vitally important. And that's been the calling card, right? So if you're and we're heavily concentrated, again, this is very New York centric, but I'll use one neighborhood that everybody knows. We're heavily concentrated in SoHo. Everybody knows that. That's an international market. Everybody knows it. And everybody knows it for a couple of things, right? Fashion, models, cool, nightlife, all those things. What you may not know about it is there's also a really, everybody knows the high-end SoHo residential lofts, right? Everybody wants that. Everybody has a picture of it in their mind's eye. Everybody has seen it in the movies. But if you make offices in that same location and you build out those offices to a really high-end finish, to an equivalent finish that you would see in a residential space, when those employees come to work, they are excited to be there. That's the amenity. When they walk out for lunch, they are happy to be walking on those streets, right? They feel like they're immersed in the culture of New York City. They're immersed in, the same energy and vibrance that gives Soho its high-end, sort of retail and high-end residential feel. For the same people, for the same reason, retailers, the ultra high-end retailers will pay any price per square foot to carve out a little space in that retail block, or high-end residential spaces will go for $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a square foot. The same neighborhood is the amenity, right? So when we're talking about these smaller boutique buildings, location is the dominant driving force, right? High-end finishes. And when I say high-end finishes, there's a couple of things that we always talk about, right? And this is going to get into the technical parts, but I will point it out. And once I point this out, you're going to see it all the time and you'll never be able to unsee it. Everybody loves high ceilings. It's one of the best things you can have in an office space, in a residential space. That's why people do double height entryways in their homes. Everybody loves high ceilings. But what nobody wants to talk about is that glass and doors are built standard, right? In Soho, where we have a concentration, some of our ceiling heights are 15 feet, right? They'll go 11 feet, 12, 13, 14, 15, whatever it is, 15 feet. And what most people will do is they will buy off-the-shelf doors and glass. And that means that maximum height for the door or the glass will be maximum 8 feet, maximum. And that's if you're buying, extra, but usually it's 7. So what does that mean if you buy, even if you spend a little extra, 8 feet? That means if you have a 13-foot ceiling, you're talking about a 5 to 6 foot soffit. Soffit, just a plain white wall, sheetrock above a piece of glass. And you lose the line of sight to the high ceiling and the high windows, right? Especially if you do perimeter. So all of a sudden, you have this really high-end space where you lose the line of sight, and you draw the eye level down and it looks squat. And you're like, you're in a space that has a 15-foot ceiling, but for some reason you're not feeling the ceiling height. It's because nobody wants to spend the money. I build full height glass, meaning the guys go in and build it on site, right? So if I have a 13-foot ceiling, I will have a 12-foot high piece of glass and just have enough to get the air conditioning in and out, right, above it, right? And that creates this grandeur. That's number one. Number two, wide plank hardwood floors, the same stuff you see in a residential space, in a high-end home, in a high-end condo. And third, which is nobody ever does this right. They say they do it right, but nobody ever gets it right. Kitchens, meeting spaces, right? They aren't just kitchenettes. This is for all the other sort of boutique landlords out there that want to get it right. Don't just build a little kitchenette. Don't put a little slab of marble or whatever. A lot of people use Caesar stone. Don't put a little slab that's 5 feet wide and 2 feet deep and call that a kitchen. No. Take the space, build a massive kitchen with a massive island. Spend the money. We spend money on real stone, real marble. Why? Is because when people go and they congregate there, because everybody does, right? Everybody congregates in that kitchen area. It's open. It's beautiful. When they're standing there at this, beautiful marble island that's 10 times nicer than I would say some of the junior employees most likely have ever had in any of their homes, they feel good being there. They just feel good. It feels good. They want to congregate there. They want to hang out there. They want to congregate in the type of kitchen that, they have on their, that they imagine. And when they're scrolling through Zillow, when they want their, $20 million mansion, build that kitchen in the office and let people use it and enjoy it. Right. So those are the three things that for sure we've noticed that people really take to when they walk into the space and they say, wow, There's a lot of other really nice, design details elements. We always talk about linear diffusers instead of the ugly ducts. We always talk about, recessed lighting and beautiful light fixtures and movable walls and all these other things. And, we furnish and we do all these extras that we spend the extra 25% on when everybody's cutting back on that last 10%. And what we noticed is in these spaces, it's either going to go one of two ways, especially in the smaller ones. You're either going to attract the companies that sort of have no run rate. They just want what they want. They need what they need. They need it to attract talent. They need it to attract investors. They need show off space. We call it, this is, they want to be able to show off their space in front of everybody. Anyway, so those two things that you touched on, and just to put a bow on it, like I said, it's location and build quality. Those are your amenities. Everything else, yeah.
Yeah, location and build quality are something we've seen play out in the data overwhelmingly, particularly location. I mean, Harvard Business Review, Wired, Forbes have all put out data that essentially says just that location is ultimately what's driving high occupancy rates, particularly in the high end space over people who put a ton of amenities in. And the same thing we've heard overwhelmingly on the podcast with conference rooms. That is a huge aspect of space that I think is underdone in the market. People need an additional gathering space, particularly on the corporate end. And that's something that people really underdo. One of the things, though, that people, I think, underdo even more is how they structure deals. There's a lot of people out there that they see the bright lights of putting a space together and they don't actually think hard enough about the financial structuring of how they can get to that point. And so I'm curious, how do you approach deal structuring and capital stacks when you're looking at a high-end property, particularly a property that, we're not talking about Class C office. You're putting some real money in there.
Yeah. Look, when it comes to that, depends on how you do your business, but ultimately everybody has to be aligned on the same vision. And you can't kid yourself that you think you're going to come into a market, and again, this is New York City specific, that you're going to come into a market and do just a little bit, right? In your underwriting, you have to commit to all the things that are real, right? What does that mean? That means all the costs required to upgrade the building itself, the base building, right? And if that means if that means building new elevators, changing cores, all those things that are costly and people don't want to do, and making sure you carry significant and enough dollars to do those pre-built suites, and making sure that you're giving enough time for downtime and lease up and free rent concessions, and just understanding the market dynamics and making sure that you're truthful and realistic in your underwriting. And then depending on what your stack looks like, if you're raising money for a deal, you need to find partners that understand the same thing, right? That have the same vision, that get that this you need to spend money to get this space leased. And if you're going to try to do it the other way, you're going to end up in a race to the bottom with a lot of maybe non-institutional groups or potentially even institutional groups that have owned buildings for decades and have a basis that you can never compete with and can race to the bottom much faster than you can. I mean, that's just what's been happening,
Yeah.
right? So, and then what happens is you get so far, it gets so low that what you realize when you get down there is there wasn't enough tenants to fill up all that space anyway. So that's off to the side. That's just a tangent. But being realistic in your underwriting, being realistic in your exits, and then one other thing that I would definitely say is if you're going to do office and you're going to do spec office, and you're going to do this sort of ultra high end boutique office, when you're structuring your loans, just be sure that your lender is comfortable with you spec building, pulling TI dollars for pre-built costs, right? And just saying it doesn't matter. It's like six or half a dozen. Whether you spend it now or you spend it when the tenant shows up. Smaller tenants, right? Sub kind of 20,000 square foot tenants, they don't carry a big real estate department inside of their group. They move quickly. It doesn't take them 2 years to move like an Amazon, right? It takes 6 months or less. And by the time they finally get around to seeing all the spaces, it turns into this 3 month scramble. And that's just realistic, right?
Yes,
So
it
if you
is. Yeah.
want to attract that tenant, that space has to be built. So you need to make sure that your partners and your lenders know that you're not just building it because you have this great vision and you want to show off how well you can design and build a space. You're building it because, a 10,000 square foot tenant usually has one major decision maker. It's usually the CEO, and he or she just walks in and goes, "Oh yeah, this is it. This is it." It's worked that way every single time. You get some of the junior staff that come. You get second, third in command. They come. They prep it. They say yeah, and they narrow it down. They see 10 spaces. It gets down to 3, and then every single time it's the same thing, right? With a 10,000 square foot company, it's always the CEO. He or she walks in and she's like, "Oh yeah, this is yeah, yeah. Just," and then they just walk out and they just tell somebody, "Yeah, yeah, just sign this one. This is the one." So that space has to be ready. So everybody inside of your entire capital stack has to go in eyes wide open, knowing that you're going to be specking the dollars to make that space marketable and leasable, because nobody's leasing your half-built space. It's just not happening. Not a 10,000 or 15,000 square foot tenant. Just not happening.
And in terms of that, how much are we talking when we're talking about post build out costs? Are you factoring in? Are we talking 10%, 20%? What are you
You mean
seeing?
for TI dollars after we build it?
Yes.
Nothing. We might move around a wall or two, or if somebody says, we kind of have different versions of the build, some that's a little bit more office heavy, some that's a little less, and somebody says, "Oh, you know what, can you put up some more walls here?" Okay, that's limited dollars. Or if somebody says, "Can you take down some walls?" Because we're constantly doing it, we're constantly building it, we're always keeping the people busy. So for the most part, I would say very little, less than 5%, if we spend anything. And that's the whole purpose, right? That's the whole point. Everybody's carrying, generally speaking, the same TI dollars. It's just a question of getting everybody on board, that's partners and lenders, to go out and spend that money to prep the space before the tenant walks in instead of after.
So one of the things that has always fascinated me about the New York market in particular is there's a unique political landscape, and a lot of it comes down to some of the zoning maps that are at play. Now, for some of our audience that's looking at development within their own markets, this is not too dissimilar to some issues that exist in places like, Chicago, and even some of the areas around the city. And so I'm curious, how has the outdated zoning map in New York played into kind of how you have looked at the development process and the redevelopment process?
So this is a really good question, and we could spend quite a bit of time on it. But I'll touch on broadly what's going on in New York City right now, and then I'll touch on sort of what made us sort of attack certain markets and try to break into certain markets. So broadly speaking, the zoning map is problematic because New York, over its history, and I'm sure a lot of other metro areas have the same problem, was an industrial and shipping sort of a place, right? Because we're on a river, we used to have ports, and when I say used to, I'm literally talking about 100 to 200 years ago. That's how outdated most of the stuff is, right? So we used to have ports, we used to have industrial centers, we used to have manufacturing, we used to have all of those things. Now, what happens is once those things disappear, it takes a long time for the market to adjust. And when I say a long time, I mean decades, right? Right now, I'm sitting in Tribeca, which is, again, well known nationally, if not internationally, as a very high end residential market. And if you walk around this market, you'll see all these big, sort of beautiful now loft buildings that were built out of old industrial buildings that were 100 to 150 years old, sometimes older, that were literally storage and manufacturing for goods and services that came off the ports well before we ever built the World Trade Center or anything like that. Now, that whole industry disappeared, and the last vestiges of it disappeared probably around the 1950s and 60s. And then it just became dilapidated and an awful place into the 70s and 80s. And then it was filled up with artists. until finally they figured out what to do with it, and they started to go residential into the 90s, right? And that's how long it took, right? I'm just using that as a case study because I want to tie that into something else that's going on right now, where the city is really trying to, so into the 90s and then into the 2000s, and all of a sudden, sort of Robert De Niro has a hotel here, and Jay-Z and Beyonce have a penthouse, right? And all of a sudden we're there. It didn't happen overnight. There was literally, there was probably the 70s and 80s, there was a 20-year period of just, this was a terrible place to be. It was a scary place, and nobody wanted to live here. Forget live here. Nobody wanted to work here. Nobody wanted to walk through here. Anyway, so something interesting is happening post COVID, and I really want to I want to give kudos to the administration for looking into this. Another part of Manhattan had a real zoning issue, and we still have it, right? We call it the Garment Center, but now they call it Midtown South because it stretches more than just the Garment Center, where there was a time, truly, in Manhattan where we called something the schmatas business, and there was these building after building of factories where people were working with cloth and things like that. And they were doing all the things related to that industry, to the fashion industry, but the manufacturing of fashion and the sales and distribution and all those other things, right? Now, that didn't really happen for a long time. And then what happened was all those buildings went office, but the zoning on them never changed, right? They were manufacturing zone. Historically, they were the last to lease up, and they were the cheapest version of office space that you can get in New York City. So when New York City was humming and booming and everybody had office space, your most expensive office space was on Park Avenue and Fifth Avenue, and then kind of your cheapest office space was in the Garment Center. What happened post-COVID? Everybody ran towards best in quality, right? So there was a rush to fill up whatever was the best. So people's footprints shrunk, and ultimately some people did work from home, and then everybody had the rush to quality, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of sections of Manhattan are the ones that carry the majority of the vacancy. And they carry the majority of the vacancy because all the buildings are the same. They look the same. They're owned non-institutionally, or even if they were owned institutionally, they were the last to lease when times were good. And when times got bad, I truly believe they became genuinely obsolete, right? And it's not like they're all vacant. Some, you'll have one building that's 70% vacant, one that's 20, but whatever. The majority is of vacancy is concentrated in these markets where all the buildings look the same, and they were historically manufacturing buildings for whatever manufacturing you want to use them for. Now, I truly believe in my heart of hearts, these buildings should not exist as office buildings, right? If they disappeared tomorrow, it would buoy the rest of the market, and New York City would look like one of the healthiest office markets of all time. The thing that the current administration is seeing is finally, somebody realized that these shouldn't be office buildings. We have a housing problem, right? We cannot build housing fast enough. No matter how many units we build, no matter how expensive they are, no matter how dark they are or bright they are, or how many roommates have to share. There'll be 4 roommates in a 1-bedroom, and one of them will be sleeping upside down in a closet, and they don't care, and they'll be happy to pay $2,000 a month for their little piece of the city. And no, it's true. It's unbelievable. And once you speak to the sort of the younger generation that moves in, whether it's for first jobs or schooling, they'll do anything to be here. They'll do anything to stay. We have a housing shortage. We cannot build these units fast enough. So what the current administration is doing is they are doing a rezoning of that huge chunk of Manhattan, right? It's called the Midtown South rezoning, to finally allow these buildings, which historically have not been manufacturing for 50 plus years, to be something other than manufacturing or office. And I think we're a couple months away from it. They also passed this, this other thing called City of Yes, where they've loosened some of the requirements of when you're converting an office building. And we were just talking about this offline before we started about the requirements that, certain things where they'll let you get around some of the new zoning laws to make sure it's easier for you to convert an office building. And the state has passed some great tax incentives, and it's a bit of a quid pro quo, right? If you want the tax incentives, you have to build 20 to 25% low income housing. If you build larger, you have to use sort of union wages or prevailing wages, as they call it. So there is a lot of things taking care of a lot of people, but the biggest part of this, just from my vantage point, is I can't see this happen fast enough. Now, is this going to happen overnight? Absolutely not. But what I truly, truly, genuinely hope, just like I gave you the story of Tribeca, is that they talk about it, that somewhere in the 2020s, they finally changed the zoning. And by 2040, all that completely useless office space was torn down. And then there's these great, super cool residential communities that have great transportation in the heart of Manhattan. And, they took down all those awful dark office buildings and built a whole bunch of new residential housing. And, with that came grocery stores and F&B and all that stuff. So that's what I genuinely think is going to happen and what I hope happens. To just circle back after my very long-winded diatribe there about what I want to happen in New York City, what happened from our perspective, and my perspective specifically, is some neighborhoods, like I said, have very high barriers to entry, right? And part of it is zoning, part of it is just difficulty of knowing how to build with certain buildings, right? The buildings that I was talking about just now in that Midtown South zoning, I hope the majority of them get torn down so that we never even have to talk about this. Just tear it down, build it new. Like, nobody needs a low ceiling dark factory building. Just let it change. Some of the markets that I find the most attractive is somewhere where you went back far enough where you have this incredible detailed architecture like a Soho. And again, I'm stuck on Soho only because I'm fascinated with that cast iron architecture and all the ways they used to build and this build quality that they used to have, and some of this architectural detailing that I personally absolutely love. And again, because it's so pretty, because it's so nice, there's a whole extra set of regulations on top of your regular sort of Department of Building regulations as to what you can and cannot do. And they're related to something called the Landmarks Preservation Commission, which wants you to maintain and never change the character of what makes the SoHo Landmark District, the SoHo Landmark District. And that adds time and complexity and architectural requirements. And look, the one thing I always point out to everybody is we change all our windows in all our buildings, and very few other people do. And the reason is some of these windows, and I'm sitting next to one right now, the reason is some of these windows are 10 feet high. And the requirement is replace in kind. So in kind means one for one. So if that used to be a 10, 12-foot high, double hung, operational wood window, you know what you have to build? Exactly what I just said. And that's not something people are used to building anymore. There's no factories pumping out, sort of 10-foot high double hung wood windows that are operational because it's just, it's cheaper to do a glass curtain wall. But we build them. We build them on site, and that's what we do. And we have new windows where a lot of people in Soho don't, right? They'll use 100-year-old window, and it's a leaded window. You can wash it, till your hands bleed. It's never going to be as clean as a brand new window. Anyway, so this is the type of stuff that creates a high barrier to entry, but also creates a demand because of the limited availability of these spaces, right? Very few are actually doing it. So when somebody sees it, they're like, oh my God, I want one, right? So it's the same as they're like, oh, I want this high-end residential loft. They see one of these high-end offices. They're like, yeah, we got to have one. We got to have one.
So one of the things we got to have is we always got to have the questions about our Real Finds Final Four. It's a nice, great way to wrap things up, and I'd like to stick kind of on these future trends and talk about where you see commercial real estate, even if it's just in New York, going over the next 10 years.
I mean, commercial real estate is it's a big segment, right? I think we're still going to have a driver in logistics and data centers. And I think more than that, if you can attach this to commercial real estate, I think the energy sector that runs the data centers is going to be a big driver. I think that, from an office perspective, it's just going to be the trend line is going to continue much the same. It's going to be less ultra high end office. And I think it's been proven that people work together better collaboratively, face to face, way better than they can ever, once we get off this sort of podcast call and we go our separate ways, we forget about what we spoke about. So those are the two sectors that I think are always going to be healthy. If you can call residential housing, especially in urban markets, sort of commercial real estate, because it technically is, I think certain markets are still going to have demand drivers, and those are the places where population is expanding. You're going to need more housing. And then, again, if you can call hotels and lodging and sort of food and beverage, commercial real estate, then I think, again, I don't think just the US economy is changing. I think it's going to remain in one direction, which is healthy and growing. And, a healthy growing economy is going to have people who want to spend money, and they're going to want to, go on vacation and go down to wherever, pick your, whatever it is, Miami, and stay in a nice hotel. So for my segment in New York, like I said, I think there's going to be an absolute explosion in either office to residential conversion, but more specifically, just more building of residential housing because there's a need. The sector is flush with capital. And I think for the next decade or so, we're going to see just an explosion in residential housing. And right now, believe it or not, there is a limit to how much new high-end office has been built because you had whatever the Hudson Yards, but that's basically all full. So I think at some point people are going to start getting their start dipping their toe back in the water to build these sort of new really high-end office buildings, and the trend line is going to continue of everybody going to those buildings and having new office leasing and retail leasing records broken, which I think the last office lease I heard was $250 a foot in some of the new ground up office space like on Park Avenue. So we're breaking records every time, and I don't think that's going to change. It's just going to be less buildings, more high end.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
think creative destruction is going to change anytime soon as long as humans remain humans.
There you go.
In terms of that, one of the things that we like to do that's part of the human condition is we have a lot of people who are starting out in their careers that listen to this podcast, at least a solid percentage. And they always love this question. And it's, what advice would you give somebody who's starting out in the industry?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a loaded question. I guess it depends where in the industry they're starting. But this is what I believe to be true. It's all in sales. You're in sales no matter which sector you're in. If you're a broker, hit the phones. If you start it as an underwriter or anybody else, you're selling somebody at all times. Whether you're a broker trying to sell a piece of property to a buyer, whether you're trying to, sell your underwriting to your boss when you're pitching a deal in committee, whether you're trying to raise money and sell your company as the next thing to invest in, just know and don't get disheartened because it's all the same thing, and it's a low probability game. It just is. Whether you're raising money and you speak to 100 investors until five take 6 months to give you a no, or you're in the brokerage business, which about, and you have to show a building 500 times till somebody finally buys it, or anything else. Don't get disheartened. It's a numbers game. Just keep working the numbers, and you'll be fine.
Always remember, I had a day once where my wife heard me at home because she was working in the room right next to me. And I was getting yelled at all day by all various people in various ways. And people can be sometimes meaner over the phone than they can in person. And and I go and we go and sit down for dinner. She's like, "Oh, how was your day?" And I was like, "Oh, it was a great day." And she goes, "Why was it a great day?" I was like, "Well, we did two
Yeah,
really big deals." And she's like, "All it seemed like was people were mad at you all day." And I said, "Well, that's the way the business works. Is all
yeah,
you do is have to have one really good hit in a day, and this was a two-hit day." Uh,
great
and,
day.
and she's sitting there going, "I do not know how you do your job." So I think that's one of the best bits of advice you can give to anybody who's starting off is
Yeah,
it's about getting hits, not about all the times you strike out.
yeah,
So
yeah.
one of the things that we love to talk about on the podcast is any books or educational materials that you think could help influence somebody who's at any point in their career, maybe reshape their mindset. It could be a podcast, anything
So,
that you're listening to that has inspired you.
so you're not gonna like this answer. So I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to my books, and I am the opposite of what I like to read and listen to. I don't listen to business podcasts, and I don't read fiction books. And the reason is this is all I do all day. So when I pick up a book, I want nonfiction. excuse me, I don't listen to nonfiction. I only want fiction. I only want, I want to get lost into some other world, or the only sort of nonfictions I read are science related. And the only podcasts I listen to that aren't, just cultural are science related. And I'm really digging on, sort of, I don't know.
So is there a book we should pick up on that?
No, I'm not going to do that because I don't want to embarrass myself on the silly fiction that I'm reading. But if you want a really corny one, there's my favorite of the fictions, and this is if you have a couple nerds in the audience, they're going to dig it. This guy named Neil Stephenson. He wrote a book called Cryptonomicon. The premise is about, it's like a historical fiction where Newton and Leibniz fight over the creation of calculus and then the first computers and stuff like that. So if you want that, read that. That's a real good nerd stuff.
We'll put that book on the list, but there is one question that there's no way that we'll let you out of, and it's the
Yeah,
whole point of the podcast. And that's, we believe that
yeah.
the men and women who are in the arena tend to know the next person to reach out to. So I'm curious, who's the next person we should talk to on the podcast?
Oh my God. You know what? I don't know. I don't know the person themselves, but you should ask around because this is something that I truly don't understand and think is what's going to drive all of commercial real estate and actually all of industry for at least the next decade is water and energy. How do you get the water to cool and the energy to power everything that we try to do, whether it's the data centers or the Tesla that I drive, right? I need to. I don't under. Is it municipalities? Is it like, are we leaving the real estate community and going to scientists? Can we create clean nuclear energy? I don't know, and I wish I did, and I wish somebody can wrap their brain around what do we do and how. I want to know how can I make a buck
Yeah.
by prepping these sites
Well,
with energy.
one of the podcasts that we filmed about a week ago, it drops the day after we're filming this right now, is with a nuclear engineer who's doing that on a number of data centers all over the Midwest.
Mhm.
Yes, that's very much on top of mind and a great recommendation. In terms of that, there's one last thing, and this is a question that I think will be relatively easy in comparison, and that's just if somebody wants to get in contact with you, Rod, what's the best way to do so?
Look, they can email me, they can call my office, leave me a message. I try to make it easy to get in touch with me if you need to get in touch with me. Like I said, I was an investment sales broker for some portion of my career, so I know how hard it is to do those reach outs. And look, I do the same thing. I reach out to people all the time. We do a lot of off market deals direct with the largest landlords here in the city. So you want to email me, you want to reach out, you have a deal you want to sell me, give me a call.
Rod,
I'll be sure to give the time.
thank you so much for this conversation today, and we have to have you on in the future. Thanks again to Rod. We appreciate his insights. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please give us a like, a 5-star review. Any interactions and subscriptions truly matter and help us continue to get quality guests. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Gordon Lamphere, the Real Finds Podcast. Thank you for listening.